So our last section for Unit 9 covers Reconstruction in the South. In this section, we'll cover the end of Reconstruction, some of the barriers put in place in the South to limit African American equality and success. And our essential question is, how and why did Reconstruction end, and should it be remembered as America's unfinished revolution? So first, let's start off with the scalawags and the carpetbaggers. These were terms coined during Reconstruction to describe different people. Scalawags were white Southerners who joined the Republican Party. Most white Southerners were Democrats, right? The Republicans are the party of Lincoln, the party of the Union, the party of the great emancipator, the party that ended slavery. So any white Southerner who joined the Republican Party was seen as a traitor and thus called a scalawag. Carpetbaggers was a term for Northerners who moved south after the war. They were called thus because of the popular carpet bag that many brought their belongings in. Most carpetbaggers came to take advantage of the war-torn South, hoping to get land for cheap, to gain positions of power and authority that they couldn't necessarily get in the North. And obviously they were seen kind of as an invasive force. Even today, right, Southerners have funny nicknames, not necessarily mean, to describe people who move from the North to the South. Carpetbaggers was intended to be a mean term because so many of them were coming to take advantage of the South in this position. However, some did come to help. There were many refugees, both black and white, in the South that needed help providing for, the necessities of life, food, clothing, all of that. So, in the South, majority of the land is still owned by just a few of the population, approximately 10%. Poor Southerners really only had access to two jobs. One was sharecropping and one was tenant farming. Let's talk a little bit about what these two jobs were. So sharecropping was a system where people who lived in poverty, who couldn't afford to buy their own land, farmed someone else's land. They basically rented that land from them and planted crops. However, most sharecroppers were too poor to even afford to pay cash rent. So their rent came from handing over a percentage of their finished crop to the landowner at the end of the growing season. So sharecroppers typically lived on the landowner's land, typically in former slave quarters. They could only buy supplies from the landowner's store, usually on credit because they don't have enough cash up front to pay. So then they live on this land, they grow what they're told to grow, and then at the end of the growing season, they usually hand over about 60% of their crop to the landowner, and this was their payment of rent. Unfortunately, in the system of sharecropping, what was left over for the sharecropper to sell did not cover all of the basic necessities to live, as well as the debt that was owed to the landowner for things like rent and the supplies bought at the beginning of the year. So this leads to a never-ending cycle of debt, which means the sharecropper cannot leave until that debt is repaid. For many of you, this probably sounds like a different type of slavery, and in many cases, it was. Especially for newly freed people whose most of their skills came in agriculture. This was all that they knew to do. They didn't have any other options, so they ended up in this sharecropping cycle, and many of them lived on the plantations that they had just had lived on prior to gaining their freedom. So the economic realities were not very different for most African Americans. Sharecropping was just like a different form of slavery. But one key difference is they are no longer legally owned by another person. Though they may not be able to leave and they may be in debt, at the end of the day, they still have their freedom. Tenant farming was another option. So this was a more independent arrangement than sharecropping was. This is where you literally just rented land from someone. You had money to pay that rent. So therefore, you can live where you want to. You can grow the crops that you want to. You can manage your crops the way that you want to. You are just paying rent on land because you don't have enough money to buy your own. Obviously, this was a preferable system, but one that many people can't afford. If we go back up to this map, if you weren't looking at it earlier, it shows the percentage of farms sharecropped by county. So we can see in many places, South Carolina, North Carolina, anywhere from 35 to 80% of the farms were sharecropped. I actually come from a family of sharecroppers. My grandfather was a sharecropper in Cumberland County. So this was a system that, impacted many families across the South. One of the few successes of Reconstruction was the establishment of public schools in the South. Under military occupation and control by the North, there is finally the establishment of a tax-supported public school system. Many people in the South, no matter their race, were illiterate because education was not their priority. So they have no education. Like my grandfather that I was just talking about as a sharecropper finished school in the 5th grade because he had to help his family work on the farm. And that was just in the 1930s, early 40s, when he was growing up. So not that long ago. So the South obviously wants the public schools to be segregated based on a separation of the races. Radical Republicans want integration, white and black students to go to school together. During the period of radical Reconstruction, there were some integrated schools, but once the South once again takes control of the South, most public schools will be segregated for a century. During Reconstruction, we also see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Many Southerners could not handle the idea of equality of African Americans. They had been taught since birth that black people were inferior to them. Even if they were not slave owners themselves, that was the culture of the South. So whenever things like the 14th and the 15th Amendment are passed, where African Americans are gaining the right to vote, where African Americans are becoming sheriffs and police chiefs, all these Southerners are freaking out about a person who is black being in a position of authority over them. Some turned to terrorism in order to fight back against this progress in the African American community. One of the main priorities of the KKK when it was first founded in the 1860s was to deny African Americans their rights, specifically the right to vote. It was also a tool to drive the Union troops out of the South and once again regain control of the South. So the Ku Klux Klan is going to use terror in order to intimidate and subdue African Americans in the South, as well as once again have the South placed in control of white Southern Democrats. So we see here this picture, the KKK is working with the White League. We see a brutalized and terrorized African American family. And it says worse than slavery. And unfortunately, during the period of Reconstruction, due to organizations like the KKK, many African Americans did face conditions that were worse than slavery, that were more brutal than anything they had ever faced under the conditions of slavery. The promises of freedom that were given to them were very different in their reality. The Republicans in control of Congress are not just going to stand by and watch the KKK terrorize the South. They passed the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871. These were also known as the KKK Acts because they were specifically made to address KKK activities. It made it a federal crime to interfere with elections, which, like we said, was one of the KKK's main goals. They sent federal marshals to supervise elections to make sure no one was being turned away at the ballot box, to watch out for violence and intimidation that would keep African Americans away from the ballot box. And it also outlawed KKK activities. Unfortunately, as much as the North tried to stop the activities of the KKK, they were still able to cause terror across the South. Most of the intimidation to keep African Americans from voting didn't happen right at the ballot box. It happened in the days beforehand when a member of the KKK would let you know that if you showed your face at the ballot box, he would kill you and your entire family. It came whenever the KKK would go around at night burning down schools and churches and homes, and making it clear that more of this would happen if African Americans continued to exercise their right to vote. Most of us, whenever we think about the KKK, think about the tall white pointy hats and white robes. That was a popular garment of the KKK, but not really until the 1920s when we see the reemergence of the KKK. The original KKK, formed in the 1860s, looked like this. And if you visit the museum in Raleigh, you could see an authentic KKK mask from the Reconstruction period in America. Some of the masks that they wore were truly terrifying. So Reconstruction comes to an end. The nation begins focusing on other issues. By now it's the mid-1870s. The war's been over for an entire decade. Most Northerners who started out with great intentions are really just tired of being involved in Reconstruction, with having troops occupy the South, paying the military to occupy the South. The United States suffers a depression in 1873, which lasted about 5 years in the United States. These economic problems were blamed on President Grant, though we know that the president often has no direct control over downturns or upturns of the economy while they are in office. What happened during the Depression of 1873? Banks closed, stocks plummeted, businesses shut down, similar to that snowball effect that we've talked about in prior panics. Unemployment goes up, more people are struggling to feed their family. So the nation's dealing with an economic depression. We're also dealing with scandal within the president's administration. The Whiskey Ring is a group of revenue officers who were convicted of stealing money directly from the federal government during Grant's administration. They kept money from excise taxes on whiskey, and then they filed false tax reports to cover up this. And in 1875 alone, they stole nearly $200 million of money from the federal government. So Republicans blamed Grant and the Democrats for the Depression, and the nation is just focusing on other issues. So the election of 1876 is what brings about the end of Reconstruction. The Republican candidate is Rutherford B. Hayes. He goes on to win the election. However, there's a popular Democratic candidate named Samuel J. Tilden. In the election of 1876, there is no majority in the Electoral College. They are tied 50-50. Hayes has one more electoral vote than Tilden. Also, there are about 20 electoral votes in dispute in Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon, which are said to be the results of election tampering. That basically these votes are fraud, and that those 20 electoral votes need to be recounted. We see over here that Tilden did win the popular vote, 51 to 48% for Rutherford B. Hayes. And we also know that in the election of 1876, Democrats in the South were using violence and fraud to win many of their votes. So we see that three southern states went to Hayes, the Republican. Those were the states that were said to be frauded, as well as Oregon over here. All right, but we know that the Democrats, the Southern Democrats, were using things like intimidation and violence to keep people away from the ballot boxes. So, who decides in the election of 1876? Since there's no majority, the House of Representatives does. A committee was set up to determine the president with members from the Senate, the House of Representatives, and Supreme Court justices. This committee consisted of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. It was supposed to be an equal number of both with an impartial member, but that impartial member turned out to be a Republican. In order to decide who won, these 15 men struck a deal. A deal was struck between the Democrats and the Republicans to decide the election of 1876. This becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. So overall, Hayes, who lost the popular vote, becomes the president. He is the Republican candidate, and he follows Ulysses S. Grant as president. However, the Democrats, their end of the deal is the end of Reconstruction. The troops are taken out of the South, which results in the end of Reconstruction. There was also a Democrat placed in Hayes' cabinet, and money was promised by the federal government to give to the South for internal improvements to help rebuild. So the Compromise of 1877 ends Reconstruction. So we see here Thomas Nast, not a truce, not a compromise. Whenever the election of 1876 was being decided, whenever it was still in contention, there were many calls for another civil war if a particular candidate won that side did not like. So this is this deal that was struck, and basically we see by this book considered the fraud of the century. You are blatantly ignoring the will of the people, and instead you have a handful of elite members of the government deciding on the election for the rest of us, striking backroom deals. So with Southerners back in power, they began restricting the rights of African Americans. These became known as Jim Crow laws, which required a separate but equal society. They put things in place to stop the black vote. One was literacy tests, which said that African Americans had to pass a literacy exam to vote. These tests were created by Southern states. The questions were super hard. Oftentimes they relied on oral exams that were subjective, that you could easily just say, no, you didn't say that correctly, you fail. Determining based on the race of the person being examined. Also, if you were a registered Democrat, you got easier questions. Poll taxes, you had to pay a tax to vote. This overwhelmingly discriminated against Black Americans in the South. They were most of the people in the South living in poverty. It was only a few dollars, but if you're deciding between food on the table and going to vote, which was already kind of dangerous, you're going to choose putting food on the table. They would also change the times to collect the poll tax and the price, so you'd show up with the 50 cents that was required, and they'd be like, oh no, it's actually 65. You don't have that other 15 cents, you can't register to vote. One of the most insidious laws was the grandfather clause, because as we know, there were poor and illiterate whites in the South as well. However, if your grandfather had voted before the Civil War, then you could vote as well, even if you couldn't pay the poll tax or pass the literacy exam. So these laws, we know, were designed specifically to disenfranchise African Americans in the South. As legitimate as these may sound, literacy test, you have to be literate to vote. Poll taxes, right? Like, this is your duty. You should be able to afford a tax to be able to vote. They were done in order to stop Black people from voting. So once Reconstruction is over, troops are taken out of the South. The Democrats come back into power. They take the South back from the radical Republicans, from the scalawags, from the carpetbaggers, and they install the type of government that they want to exist under. One that puts the white man in charge and limits the freedom and equality of African Americans. We call these governments Redeemer governments. It also gives birth to the term the Solid South. This begins the tradition of voting almost totally for Democrats in the South, especially in presidential elections. So for almost 100 years, the Democratic Party is in charge of the South, and they are the party of poll taxes and literacy tests and the Ku Klux Klan and segregated schools and inequality for African Americans. We can see here we have the Confederate States, a government official, all of these people working together to keep the Black man down. So I'd like you to take a few minutes in your notes and list some of the successes of Reconstruction that you can think of, and then what are the failures of Reconstruction. Keep in mind the laws that were added to the Constitution that will eventually be upheld, but then the reality of how those amendments played out. after the end of Reconstruction.